On the outskirts of a small town called Red Willow, Nebraska, stretched the vast wheat fields owned by the Miller family. These fields were where Henry Miller, his wife Sue, and their 3 children, Mary, Laura, and Albert, lived a peaceful and quiet life. The family had long resided in a simple but cozy wooden house, surrounded by a sea of wheat that extended as far as the eye could see. Henry was a man in his 40s, with a strong build from years of working on the farm. His face was rough and sunburnt, but there was a softness in his eyes, especially when he was with his family. He was known as a quiet man who always put his family first. A hard-working person, Henry took care of the large wheat fields with great dedication. Early in the morning, he would wake up, check the condition of the soil and crops, ensuring everything was in order. His wife, Sue, was a gentle and caring woman. Her brown hair was often neatly tied up as she took care of the house. Though she appeared small and delicate, Sue was the backbone of the Miller family. From looking after the house to caring for their 3 children, she did it all skillfully. She spent her days cooking, cleaning the house, and preparing the family's daily needs. The Miller family's home stood strong in the middle of their fields, far from the hustle and bustle of the village. Their life was so peaceful, as if disconnected from the outside world. There were no nearby neighbors, only empty fields stretching to the horizon. At night, the quietness was only broken by the howling of stray dogs or the sound of the wind whispering through the wheat. Their children, 15-year-old Mary, 12-year-old Laura, and 10-year-old Albert, brought joy to the house. Mary, the eldest daughter, was quiet but responsible. Her long black hair was often simply tied, and she had a keen interest in books and studying. She was a smart student and aspired to continue her education, even though they lived in a small town like Red Willow. Laura, the second child, had a free spirit and endless curiosity. With her blonde hair often left loose, she spent her time exploring the fields, climbing trees, and running around with Timmy, the family's beloved dog. Laura was energetic and always full of life. She was constantly curious about everything, although her curiosity often got her into small troubles. Meanwhile, Albert, the youngest, was different. Since he was little, he often felt uncomfortable in crowds. Albert had big green eyes that always seemed full of questions. There was something odd about him, a mysterious aura that even his family couldn't explain. Sometimes he could sense things that others couldn't. Maybe it was just a child's imagination, but often Albert would say things that caused Sue a slight unease. He looked like a normal boy, but there was something unusual behind his deep gaze. Every day, Henry would take his 3 children to school in the nearby town. They traveled in the family's old pickup truck, which had become a part of their daily routine, crossing quiet dirt roads surrounded by wheat fields. Red Willow wasn't a big town, but the school there was decent. Each morning, the sound of the pickup's engine rattling became a part of the Miller family's life, a symbol of the stability and peacefulness of their existence. The Miller family's life, though simple, was peaceful. Henry and Sue were grateful for what they had. Far from the city's hustle and bustle, they felt safe in their home, far from civilization. Their loyal guard dog, Timmy, was always around the house. The brown dog often followed Henry to the fields or played with Laura in the backyard. Timmy's howling was often the only sound at night, adding to the sense that the family was truly isolated from the outside world. At night, after all the chores were done and the children were asleep, Henry and Sue often sat on the porch, gazing at the quiet wheat fields under the moonlight. The cool evening breeze brought peace, while the sound of crickets and owls created a soothing rhythm from nature. This house, in the middle of the fields, was the perfect place for them. With no outside disturbances, their life felt simple but meaningful. Every morning, just as dawn was breaking, Henry would already be up, preparing the pickup truck to take the children to school. Sue, accustomed to the routine, would prepare breakfast with eggs and wheat bread. Mary and Laura usually woke up on time, while Albert was often late and had to be woken up several times by Sue. The mornings at their house were always busy, but filled with the warmth of family. In the truck, the children would often chat or joke while Henry drove quietly. They passed along the long dirt roads, flanked by wheat fields on both sides. Red Willow was a small village with only a few hundred residents, so the ride to school was usually quiet, except for the sound of the old pickup filling the morning silence. After dropping them off, Henry would return to the fields to start another day of work, tending to the wheat that sustained his family. The air at the end of October felt colder in Red Willow, Nebraska. The Miller family's wheat fields, which usually glowed with golden light in the summer sun, now looked darker and gloomier. The wheat leaves began to wither and dry, rustling softly as the cold autumn wind blew through them. The sky above the fields was often covered with thick, slow-moving clouds, blocking the sunlight that rarely appeared. Occasionally, faint sunlight would break through the clouds, only to be quickly covered again by a thin mist hanging low over the vast wheat fields. The trees around the fields began to lose their leaves, adding to the quiet and melancholic atmosphere. The bare branches looked like hands reaching for the sky, revealing their naked form after the long summer. The wind blew stronger, carrying the sound of the rustling wheat, resembling a faint whisper, as if the fields themselves were trying to speak, but no one could understand their words. In the distance, the Miller family's wooden house appeared small and isolated in the middle of the vast fields. Occasionally, the howling of stray dogs or wolves could be heard from the hills, filling the long, cold nights with eerie sounds. Each night, arriving earlier than usual, was accompanied by a different kind of darkness, thicker, more frightening, as if something was hiding in the shadows of the wheat that softly swayed in the wind. As Halloween approached, the Miller family remained busy as usual, though an uneasy feeling began to creep into their hearts, even if no one openly admitted it. Henry, despite being preoccupied with preparing the fields for the upcoming harvest, couldn't shake the sense that this year felt a little different. The afternoons in the fields became increasingly quiet, and he often felt as though he was being watched. However, when he turned around, all he saw was the wind gently swaying the dry stalks of wheat. Inside the house, Sue started preparing for the annual Halloween celebration in their small town. Though modest, Red Willow always celebrated Halloween with a small parade, costumes, and a party in the town hall. Like every year, Sue worked on making costumes for their 3 children. Mary, now 15 years old, requested something simple, a black dress with a witch's hat. Laura, with her cheerful and creative nature, chose to be a forest fairy, while Albert, quiet as usual, didn't give much thought to his costume. As Sue continued to knit and sew, her mind was constantly distracted by a growing sense of unease. During these preparations, Albert seemed more restless than usual. His large eyes often looked at things no one else seemed to notice. Several times he quietly stared out the window toward the vast wheat fields behind the house. When asked, Albert would simply shake his head, but Sue noticed that her youngest son often appeared pale and anxious, especially as night fell. Sometimes Albert would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing something, a soft whisper that seemed to come from the fields. Timmy, the family's usually energetic and cheerful dog, also began showing signs of unease. He often barked for no apparent reason toward the wheat barn, which stood a little distance from the house. Occasionally, he would growl softly, standing with his fur raised along his back, even though Henry couldn't see anything. Henry tried to reassure Sue and the children that it was just their imagination, perhaps brought on by the changing season. As Halloween night drew closer, the Miller family went about their daily routines as usual, trying to ignore the unsettling feelings that lingered. During the day, they were busy tending to the house and the fields. Henry, though aware of the strange atmosphere around him, continued working hard in the fields, hoping to harvest the wheat before the weather worsened. Sue focused on the Halloween preparations while keeping a close eye on Mary, Laura, and Albert, who seemed to be growing more tired lately. Every evening, after the children returned from school, the family gathered around the dinner table. They would talk about school, friends, and town events, but something felt different. Mary, who usually spoke a lot about her future plans, had become quieter. Laura, typically full of energy, started feeling uneasy when she was alone, especially outside, as dusk approached. As night fell, the Miller family gathered in their cozy living room, with a warm fire crackling in the fireplace, chatting about their plans for Halloween. However, with each passing night, the darkness outside grew deeper, and the night wind carried strange sounds, whispers from the fields that had never been heard before. The sounds were unclear, like faint murmurs drifting with the breeze. Sometimes they resembled soft laughter, other times like muffled screams. The Millers never talked about it, but they all felt the growing unease. The day before Halloween, Red Willow began preparing for the annual celebration. Homes were decorated with pumpkins, lanterns, and spooky ornaments. The Millers usually joined in with excitement, but this time they felt hesitant. Sue complained of unusual fatigue, and Mary started showing signs of constant mild headaches. Despite this, they still tried to follow the tradition. That night, as the family was getting ready for bed, the whispers that had been faint before became clearer. The sounds were no longer coming from outside, but seemed to be coming from within the walls of their own home, from the shadows in the corners of the room. Albert, who was the most sensitive, began waking up in the middle of the night, disturbed by whispers only he could hear. The Halloween atmosphere, which was supposed to be filled with joy, had now turned into something unsettling. Something dark and sinister, buried within the wheat fields they had tended to for years, was slowly awakening as Halloween night approached. What had once seemed like just the wind now became a real and growing terror. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, covering the stars and the moon. Inside the house, Henry Miller sat in his rocking chair on the porch, enjoying the usual quiet that accompanied him after a long day working in the fields. The wind carried the distinct scent of autumn, with dry leaves swirling around their yard. But something was different that night. There was a sense of unease in the air, something unexplainable, yet unmistakable. Around midnight, Timmy, their family dog, suddenly jumped up from his sleep in the corner of the porch and began barking toward the wheat barn, which stood not far from the house. His howling pierced through the still night, startling Henry. He stood up and stared at the barn, seeing nothing but the dark shadows cast by the moonlight, now hidden behind the clouds. Maybe it's just a raccoon or a coyote wandering through the fields, he thought to himself. However, as Henry was about to go back inside, his ears caught an unusual sound. It was like a whisper, very soft and unclear where it came from. He froze, trying to listen more closely. The whisper seemed to come from inside the barn, carried by the cold night wind. Frowning, Henry tried to shake off the growing unease in his mind. "It's probably just the wind," he muttered to himself before stepping back inside. But Timmy continued barking, as if trying to warn them of something lurking nearby. The next morning, Henry didn't mention what he had heard. Sue, his wife, sensed something was wrong when she woke up and found Timmy had stayed up all night, looking restless. "Maybe it was just a coyote," Henry explained briefly, trying to ease his wife's anxiety. But the following night, the sounds returned. This time they were louder, clearer, as if something or someone inside the barn was trying to break free. The whispers sounded like many small voices speaking all at once. Incomprehensible but terrifying. Henry woke up again when Timmy started barking, louder than the night before. Mary, their eldest daughter, also woke up and came to her parents' room, looking frightened. "Dad, there's something outside," she said, her voice trembling. Henry grabbed his flashlight and jacket, deciding to check the barn. As he stepped outside, the night air grew colder and the wind blew harder. His steps were slow but determined as he walked toward the barn. The closer he got, the clearer the sounds became. Small screams and faint whispers mixed together, filling the air around him. Henry's heart raced, but he tried to stay calm. When he opened the barn door, there was only darkness and silence. No animals, no coyotes or raccoons as he had previously thought. The barn was empty, with only the smell of wheat and old wood. However, Henry felt an unnatural cold inside, sending a chill down his spine. He shone his flashlight into every corner of the barn, but found nothing. Only silence greeted him, as if the sounds had vanished the moment he opened the door. Returning to the house, Henry felt something wasn't right. That night, the strange noises lingered in his mind, disturbing his restless sleep. From that night on, the sounds in the barn became more frequent. The whispers grew louder, more unsettling. Sometimes it sounded like someone screaming for help, only to change into eerie, broken laughter. The Miller family began to feel the growing tension day by day. Sue, usually strong and calm, started to look worried. She often gazed toward the barn from the kitchen window, as if expecting something to emerge from behind the old door, which now remained firmly shut. Their children were also affected by the strange noises. Laura started waking up in the middle of the night, crying for no reason. "I hear someone whispering at the window, Mom," she said, her wide eyes trying to hold back tears. Sue tried to comfort her daughter, but deep down she shared the same fear. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the strange sounds were getting closer to the house. The most affected was Albert, who had a sharper sensitivity than his siblings. He often woke up pale, saying he saw shadows in the fields or heard voices calling his name from afar. "There's something out there, Dad. They're watching us," he whispered one night. Henry, not wanting to scare his family further, tried to dismiss it, although he knew in his heart that something was very wrong. What disturbed them the most was when the sounds were no longer confined to the barn. They began to creep into the house. On certain nights, Henry and Sue could hear whispers coming from behind the walls of their bedroom. The voices sounded as if someone was speaking right into their ears, but whenever they searched for the source, no one was there. The doors sometimes creaked on their own, and the old wooden floor seemed to tremble lightly, even though no one was walking on it. The Miller family's nights became increasingly uneasy. Timmy, once a cheerful and loyal dog, now often barked at empty corners of the house for no apparent reason. He no longer slept peacefully but stayed alert, with his ears perked up, as if ready to confront something invisible. Henry tried to stay strong, but every time he stepped outside, his gaze was drawn to the barn, which now seemed more menacing. He could no longer deny that something was stalking his family from the darkness. The sounds were not those of wild animals, and the disturbances could not be explained by simple logic. They were on the brink of something far more terrifying than just autumn winds or the colder nights. Each night, when the strange noises from the barn began, the howling of wolves could be heard more frequently in the distance. Henry could no longer ignore their presence. The howls echoed back and forth, coming from all directions, as if forming a circle around their fields. What had once been faint howls now sounded closer, as if the wolves were at the edge of the field, waiting for something. The howls no longer seemed like just animal sounds. They felt like a call, or perhaps a warning. Every night, the howls began earlier, even before the eerie sounds from the barn. Whenever the wolves howled, the air around their house grew colder, as if chilled by something rising from the ground itself. The Miller family could sense the presence of a darkness growing nearer, even though they couldn't see it with their eyes. But Albert saw more than just sounds and howls. His sharp and sensitive eyes began to notice shadows that no one else could see. Since the whispers from the barn had started invading the house, Albert began to see things more clearly and more frighteningly. At first, the shadows appeared in the corners of the rooms, moving quickly, as if they were just illusions from the corner of his eye. But over time, the shadows became more real and seemed to grow closer. One night, after waking to the sound of soft whispers calling his name, Albert opened his eyes and saw something that froze his blood. In the corner of his room, near the half-open window, stood a large shadow. Its shape was unclear, but it was taller than any human, with a hunched posture and long arms that dangled like dry branches. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Albert's eyes widened, his body paralyzed, and his tongue frozen. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. Every time Albert tried to close his eyes, the shadow seemed to come closer. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, and even though he squeezed his eyes shut as tightly as he could, the shadow seemed to slip into his mind. When he finally gathered the courage to open his eyes again, the shadow was gone, but the chilling cold it left behind remained. Since that night, these shadows began appearing more frequently. Albert could see them moving inside the house, darting through the hallway, or standing still in dark corners. Among the Miller family, only Albert could see them, and although he tried to tell his parents, they couldn't understand what he was really seeing. Sue and Henry assumed it was just the imagination of a frightened boy, but they themselves couldn't ignore the fact that something strange was happening in their home. Meanwhile, the health of Sue, Mary, and Laura began to deteriorate in ways that couldn't be explained. Sue, who was usually full of energy and always busy around the house, now often woke up feeling weak and with a throbbing headache. Her eyes appeared sunken, and her skin began to lose its color. She felt as if something was draining her energy each night, making her body weaker by the day. There were no signs of physical illness, yet Sue felt like something was slowly eating away at her from the inside. Mary and Laura were experiencing similar issues. Mary, usually serious and disciplined about her schoolwork, now often seemed lost in thought and unable to focus. She frequently complained of constant headaches, and her face grew pale with dark circles under her eyes. Laura, once lively and cheerful, had become quiet and started sleeping during the day. She began having the same nightmare every night, where she ran through the wheat fields but couldn't escape, while strange voices followed her. Only Albert seemed unaffected by the physical exhaustion, but his mind was being worn down by the shadows that constantly haunted his sight. He knew something was watching them, but he didn't know how to stop it. As the family's health worsened, so did the condition of their once thriving wheat fields. Henry, who inspected the fields carefully each day, noticed that much of their crop had started to rot overnight. The wheat, which should have been golden and healthy, had suddenly turned black and decayed. The stalks wilted, emitting a foul odor. When Henry tried to pull up some of the plants, the roots were soft and damaged, as if something was draining the life from the soil. Henry did his best to save what remained, but the strangeness was spreading too quickly to control. Every time he checked the field, more plants had become infected. His face grew more tense, and his anxiety deepened. The fields, which had always been the source of his family's livelihood, were now turning into a sea of dead crops, releasing a rotten stench that made the air around the house feel heavy. The decaying fields only added to the mental strain on the family. Sue, who normally supported Henry in every situation, was now too weak to get out of bed for hours at a time. Mary and Laura spent most of their days sleeping, leaving Henry alone to face the dying crops and the growing sense of dread that slowly overtook their home. Night after night, the atmosphere in the house became more oppressive. The howls of wolves continued to echo from afar, yet strangely, none of them ever appeared near the fields or the house. Timmy, the family's faithful dog, no longer barked like he used to. He would simply sit in the corner of the house, trembling, his gaze fixed on the window that faced the barn. As the night deepened, the Miller family's home, once a refuge from the outside world, had transformed into a place full of threats. Every sound, shadow, and creeping coldness seeping into the walls threatened to break the family's fragile balance. Henry knew that what they were experiencing wasn't a coincidence. There was a force greater than them, something pulling them into a darkness they couldn't fight. But no one knew how to stop the terror, and the nights grew longer, as if the darkness itself was reluctant to leave, tightening its cold grip on them. That night, the Miller house was eerily quiet, with only the faint ticking of the wall clock breaking the silence. In contrast to the lively Halloween celebrations happening in the town of Red Willow, Sue, Mary, Laura, and Albert lay weak in their beds. Their bodies had grown thin, their skin pale, as if drained by an unseen dark force. Henry, sitting by Sue's bedside, watched his wife anxiously. Sue, who was usually full of life, now looked so fragile. Outside, the howling of wolves grew louder and closer, like the shadow of death closing in on their home. In the midst of that tense stillness, Albert, who had been in a deep sleep, suddenly woke up with a loud scream. His voice echoed through the house, causing Henry to jump in alarm. Albert's eyes were wide open, but something was different. His gaze was empty, as if the eyes were no longer his own. His face was pale, yet his lips moved, speaking in a voice that didn't belong to him. "You must know, Henry, the time has come for the truth to be revealed." The voice was heavy and cold, echoing from Albert's stiff mouth. Henry felt the hairs on his neck stand up, and his heart pounded faster. Albert, seemingly possessed by an evil spirit, began to speak in a language Henry had never heard before. Yet, strangely, Henry understood every word. "Every 100 years, this curse returns," Albert said in a chilling voice. "Because of your ancestors, Henry. The Miller family is the cause of all this." Henry stood frozen, his body tense as he listened. Albert detailed a terrifying truth. Hundreds of years ago, on a Halloween night, the people of Red Willow, including Henry's ancestors, performed a ritual to summon spirits. They sought power and wealth, and to achieve this, they called upon dark spirits from another world. But they failed to control the forces they had unleashed. The curse had returned every 100 years, and now it was Henry's turn, along with his family, to be the link between the spirit world and the human world. "You have a choice," the spirit speaking through Albert said, its gaze cold and piercing. "Continue your family's legacy and harness our power, or break the bond forever. But remember, if you break the bond, you and your family may not survive." Henry collapsed onto the floor, his heart filled with confusion and fear. He looked at his children, their bodies weak and barely moving. Sue lay on the bed, her breathing shallow, barely conscious. Everything now rested on his shoulders. But he knew that this decision wasn't about power or wealth. It was about saving his family from destruction. With a heavy heart, Henry decided that the cursed bond had to be broken. He couldn't allow his family to remain trapped in this cycle of the curse. As the spirit possessing Albert had told him, the ritual had to be performed at the place where the spirits were first summoned, the old barn in the middle of the now rotting wheat fields. Albert recited the words of a chant that Henry would need to speak during the ritual. In the dead of night, with the howling of wolves growing louder and the cold wind biting at them, Henry carried the weakened Sue while struggling to support Mary and Laura, who were nearly helpless. Albert, still possessed, walked with stiff steps, as if drawn by an invisible force. They moved slowly toward the barn, which now stood in the middle of a field that felt lifeless. The air around them grew heavier with each step, and it became increasingly difficult to move. The once thriving wheat was now nothing more than rotten stalks, filling the air with a foul, decaying odor. When they reached the barn, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The wind blew fiercely, as if it wanted to tear through everything in its path, making the barn door creak as though challenging them to enter. Henry forced himself to stay calm, despite the heavy pounding of his heart, trying not to let fear take over. He gently laid Sue and the children on the cold, dusty floor of the barn, then opened the book containing the ritual. The ritual demanded a spiritual sacrifice, a complete severing of the ancestral bond that connected their family to the spirit world. Henry had to recite the ancient chant, then sprinkle the blood of his family onto the ground in the barn as a symbol of breaking their ties to the past. However, the blood could not come from a wound made by human hands. It had to be from a wound blessed by the spirits. Henry pulled a small knife from his pocket. His hands trembled as he made a small cut on his hand, letting the blood drip onto the ground in front of them. The howling of wolves grew louder, and the wind began swirling inside the barn, carrying black shadows that flickered all around them. These shadows started to close in, crawling along the walls like dark spirits demanding new souls. Henry began to recite the chant he had memorized. His voice shook, but he continued with determined resolve. With each word he spoke, the shadows drew closer, becoming more real. They seemed like formless creatures, yet they radiated a terrifying dark power. The whispers grew louder, as if the spirits were challenging Henry's ritual. As he uttered the final words of the chant, the swirling shadows inside the barn suddenly froze. The whispers turned into a long, piercing scream that chilled the Miller family's blood. The shadows began to retreat, drawn back into the darkness at the corners of the barn, drifting away like thick smoke carried by the wind. Then, silence fell. The wind stopped, the howling wolves vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere in the barn lifted. Henry collapsed to his knees, his body trembling, cold sweat dripping down his face. Sue, Mary, Laura, and Albert lay still, their faces more peaceful, but their breathing was weak. Henry tried to approach his family, but his body was weak. His vision became blurry, and in that instant, Henry collapsed to the barn floor, unconscious alongside the rest of his family amidst the silence that had just fallen. The morning after the dreadful ritual, the Miller family awoke in the quiet wheat barn. The warm morning sun shone over the once fertile fields, now barren and lifeless, with their wheat crops rotting and the land that had once provided sustenance now barren. The morning air felt empty, as though the dark force that had haunted them had left, leaving behind only silence and destruction. With his body weak and exhausted, Henry gazed at their home in the distance. It stood as a silent witness to the terror they had endured, but it was no longer the same place. The fields and barn, once the heart of their lives, had become places filled with dark memories they could never forget. In every corner, the shadows of the past seemed to linger, reminding them of the curse they had never known existed. Sue, still weak but slowly recovering, realized that their family could no longer stay in this place. Mary and Laura, once full of energy and happiness, were now much quieter. They often sat near the window, staring blankly at the fields where they used to play. Albert, their youngest and most sensitive to the dark forces, had grown silent after the ordeal. Although the curse had been broken, his experience of being possessed left him withdrawn, as if he could still feel the lingering presence of the evil spirits. After days of recovering, the Miller family came to the painful realization that they had no choice but to leave the farm and the house they had called home for so many years. The curse might have ended, but the price they had paid was steep. The land was dead, and with it, the life they had built was ruined. They could no longer remain in a place filled with such painful memories, where the shadow of their ancestors' involvement in a dark ritual still haunted every corner. As they packed their belongings, a sense of sadness and loss filled their hearts. Henry, with trembling hands, rolled up the old family photos hanging on the walls, while Sue gathered the small items that once held memories of happier times. Every object they packed seemed to carry bitter memories, the joy of the past now erased by the darkness that had revealed their family's cursed origins. When the day of farewell arrived, the Miller family stood in front of their house for the last time. Timmy, their loyal dog, paced restlessly around them, as if sensing the same sadness. Henry held Sue's hand, her eyes filled with tears. Mary, Laura, and Albert stood beside them, gazing at the house they once thought was the safest place in the world. Now that house was only a symbol of a past they could no longer return to. With heavy steps, they walked away, knowing they would never come back. After leaving Red Willow, the Miller family slowly accepted the haunting truth that they were part of a dark legacy that had long been hidden. Henry carried the heaviest burden, as he was the heir to ancestors who had been involved in the summoning of dark spirits centuries ago. The curse that haunted his family wasn't a coincidence, but the consequence of past sins that had been kept secret for years. Although Henry had managed to break the bond, the bitter feeling remained. His family, without knowing it, had been part of a history of darkness that nearly destroyed them. With the secrets now revealed, the Miller family had to live with the knowledge that they could never completely escape the shadow of the past. Henry felt weighed down by the reality that his family had to pay the price for their ancestors' sins, even though they themselves had never taken part in the cursed ritual. Mary and Laura, still teenagers, tried to grasp the bitter truth, while Albert, who had witnessed the darkness firsthand, often sat in silence, as if still feeling the remnants of the evil that had once consumed him.